Between 1940 and 1942, at the height of the Battle of Britain, German Abwehr intensified its infiltration operations on British soil, dispatching agents specialized in sabotage and military intelligence gathering. Meanwhile, MI5 was developing in Bletchley Park one of the most sophisticated counter-espionage systems in history, based on intercepting and decoding enemy communications. Few knew that this invisible war was being waged with surgical precision, one that would soon turn hunters into prey. The note arrived on a cold November morning, stamped with the bureaucratic precision the Germans so despised. 3 encrypted lines, scribbled on ordinary paper, held the seed of the greatest humiliation the Abwehr would suffer on British soil. Wilhelm Hoffmann folded the paper carefully, tucking it into the inside pocket of his overcoat as he walked along the docks of Dover, convinced his mission was an absolute success. German spies mocked the British Secret Service, until their own network was destroyed, was still only a distant hypothesis in the minds of MI5 officers. But in the shadows of Bletchley Park, someone had already begun weaving the thread that would strangle the entire operation. The silent war was only beginning, and the hunters did not yet realize they had become the prey. The vessel approached the British coast on a moonless night, slicing through the black waters of the English Channel with the studied silence of those who know every meter of enemy territory. Wilhelm Hoffmann adjusted the collar of his English overcoat, meticulously chosen to avoid suspicion, as he felt the gentle sway of the fishing boat that had carried them from Calais. Beside him, Klaus Richter checked for the 10th time the forged documents identifying them as wool traders from Scotland. Each stamp and signature reproduced with the technical perfection only Abwehr laboratories could achieve. The salty smell of the sea mingled with the sharp scent of diesel oil, creating a heavy atmosphere that seemed to carry the weight of the mission ahead. Hoffmann inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the morning's icy air, and for the first time in months felt something close to pure excitement. England lay before them like a sleeping woman, vulnerable and unaware of the intruders. Months of intensive training in Brandenburg, endless hours memorizing London maps and regional British accents, all converged on this precise moment when they would set foot on enemy soil. Richter muttered something about the ease with which they had crossed the coastal defenses, and Hoffmann nodded with a cold smile, already imagining the triumphant report he would send to Berlin. The boat bumped softly against the small stone pier, and the old fisherman who had brought them waved briefly before vanishing back into the darkness, taking with him any trace of their passage. Hoffmann jumped ashore first, feeling beneath his feet the uneven texture of the damp stones, slick with the salt spray that clung to everything in that coastal region. Richter followed silently, carrying the leather case that held the most advanced transmission equipment German technology had yet produced, devices capable of sending encrypted messages to any point in occupied Europe, without the British even detecting the signal's origin. A strong wind blew in from the sea, bringing with it the acrid aroma of seaweed and salt that clung to their skin like an invisible mark. A constant reminder that they were far from home, in hostile territory where every misstep could mean death. They climbed the narrow trail leading up from the beach, stepping on loose pebbles that rolled beneath their shoes with sharp, dry clicks, sounds that seemed to echo dangerously in the stillness of the pre-dawn. With each step, Hoffmann felt a growing certainty that the British were indeed as naive as German intelligence reports had suggested. Their coastal defenses were laughable, their patrol systems primitive, and their famed composure nothing more than a disguise for a military incompetence soon to be exposed to the world. Richter murmured that he hoped London would prove as easy to penetrate as the Channel crossing, and Hoffmann replied with a restrained laugh that was lost in the sound of the wind. The road to the first train station stretched before them like a gray ribbon cutting through the desolate English countryside, punctuated only by a few weather-worn wooden fences and low shrubs bowed under the weight of constant dampness. Hoffmann checked his pocket watch. They still had 2 hours before the first train to London, time enough to review their documents once more and rehearse the answers they would give if questioned by local authorities. The plan was simple and elegant. They would establish themselves in London as merchants, rent a discreet apartment in the Bloomsbury district, and immediately begin collecting information on RAF movements. These data would be transmitted directly to the German High Command through a code system considered undecipherable by the Reich's best cryptographers. Richter briefly opened the case, making sure the radio components had not been damaged during the voyage. His fingers moved familiarly across the delicate circuits that represented the pinnacle of military communications engineering. The scent of metal and rubber rising from the equipment gave him a sense of security, as though those wires and valves formed an invisible bridge connecting him directly to the heart of the Nazi Empire. Hoffman watched the care with which his companion handled the instruments and felt a wave of professional pride. They were the best agents the Abwehr had trained, men capable of becoming completely invisible in any environment, and now they were about to demonstrate their superiority on enemy soil. England would pay dearly for her arrogance. The train that would take them to London appeared on the horizon like an iron serpent spewing steam, its piercing whistle cutting through the morning silence as it approached the small rural station where they waited among a few early-rising passengers. Hoffman discreetly studied the faces around him, farm workers, one or two merchants, simple people seemingly oblivious to the fact that two of Europe's most highly trained spies stood just a few feet away, carrying secrets that could alter the course of the war. The locomotive screeched to a halt, releasing a cloud of steam that enveloped the platform in a dense, warm fog, creating for a few moments a natural curtain that shielded them from curious eyes. They boarded the third-class carriage, choosing seats near the window from which they could watch the English landscape without attracting attention, their movements calculated with the precision of men who had rehearsed every gesture hundreds of times during training. The interior of the train smelled of cheap tobacco and damp wool, a distinctive mixture that Hoffman would forever associate with those first moments on enemy soil, when everything still seemed possible and victory was merely a matter of time and technical skill. Richter placed the case between his legs, keeping one hand on it at all times, a gesture that might seem casual to any inattentive observer, but revealed the weight of responsibility both men felt for the mission's success. The train began to move with gentle jolts, rocking the passengers in a hypnotic rhythm that contrasted with the controlled tension running through the Germans' veins. With each mile, London drew closer, and with it the true test of their abilities as infiltrated agents, the ultimate challenge that would determine whether months of preparation were enough to deceive the Secret Service of one of the world's most experienced espionage nations. Hoffman gazed through the fogged window, watching the rolling green hills of a bucolic landscape that stood in stark contrast to the bombed-out cities of continental Europe, and felt a twinge of contempt for the apparent British tranquility. This peace was artificial, maintained only because they had yet to feel the full weight of the German war machine. Soon they would discover that their famed resilience was nothing but an illusion, fed by the geographical distance that separated them from the continent. Richter murmured that he was eager to begin the work, and Hoffman nodded gravely, already picturing the first reports he would send to Berlin, documents proving not only the mission's viability but also the tactical inferiority of the British. The rhythmic creak of wheels on the rails created a hypnotic soundtrack that seemed to cradle their thoughts, turning each metallic beat into confirmation that they were on the right path, following a perfect plan executed by perfect men. The rough texture of the seat fabric beneath their hands constantly reminded them of the reality of their situation. They were truly here, on enemy soil, about to launch one of the most ambitious intelligence operations of the war. Within 48 hours, Berlin will know more about RAF movements than Churchill himself, Hoffman murmured, watching the first London chimneys emerge on the horizon like accusing fingers pointed toward the sky. The apartment on Russell Square was exactly what Hoffman had hoped to find, a calculated mediocrity that would allow two supposed Scottish merchants to pass unnoticed. Among the petty bourgeois Londoners still trying to maintain their routines despite the nightly bombings, the faded wallpaper exuded a persistent smell of mildew and stale tobacco, an aroma that intensified in the corners where the damp London air had created dark stains resembling maps of uncharted territories. Richter discreetly tested the strength of the wooden floorboards, locating the spots where the planks made no sound under weight. Knowledge, essential for their future. Nighttime transmissions, when even the slightest creak could arouse the curiosity of sleepless neighbors. Mrs. Pemberton, the landlady, was exactly the type of Englishwoman the Abwehr manuals described as ideal for their needs. A middle-aged widow, absorbed in her own financial worries and completely uninterested in the private lives of tenants as long as the rent was paid on time. Hoffman noted how she avoided direct eye contact as she explained the house rules, her voice taking on that monotonous tone, typical of someone who has repeated the same instructions for decades. The apartment was on the second floor, a strategic position that offered a partial view of the central square while also providing two distinct escape routes, the main staircase and a fire escape leading to a side alley frequented only by stray cats and the occasional drunk. Richter remarked in German that the place seemed perfect, and Hoffman silenced him with an icy glance, reminding him silently that from that moment on they would speak only English, even when they believed they were alone. The routine they established in the first days was meticulously planned to create the impression of two businessmen trying to rebuild commercial connections, interrupted by the war, an activity that would justify their frequent outings and meetings with different people without arousing suspicion. Every morning, Hoffman walked to a cafe near the British Museum, where he always ordered the same breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and strong tea, while reading the London newspapers closely, absorbing information about civilian morale, rationing, and troop movements that appeared disguised in seemingly innocent articles on domestic economics. The bitter taste of English tea, which at first had repulsed him, was beginning to feel familiar, as was the morning ritual of listening to whispered conversations among other patrons who discussed the latest war news with that characteristic blend of anxiety and determination he had learned to identify as typically British. Richter, for his part, spent his mornings exploring different neighborhoods, always carrying a notebook in which he pretended to jot down addresses of potential suppliers, but in reality was carefully mapping the locations of military installations, underground stations that could serve as air raid shelters, and government buildings showing obvious security vulnerabilities. The smell of burning coal that permeated the London streets mingled with the sharp odor of paints and varnishes used in reconstruction work, creating a heavy atmosphere that seemed to carry the weight of a city struggling to stay upright under constant pressure. Each afternoon they met back at the apartment to compare observations, their voices kept to a whisper as they compiled information to be turned into encrypted reports for the German High Command. The transmission equipment Richter had set up in a hidden compartment behind the wardrobe represented the cutting edge of military communications technology, a collection of valves and circuits capable of sending coded messages to any German receiver in Europe without British interception systems being able to detect the source or decipher the content. The first transmissions were sent on a specific frequency during the interval between BBC evening programs, a time when London's radio waves created natural interference, masking any strange signals that might otherwise attract enemy attention. Hoffman felt a deep satisfaction watching Richter handle the controls with the skill of a virtuoso, his fingers gliding over the knobs with precise movements that transformed casual observations into military intelligence of inestimable value. The low hum that emanated from the equipment during transmissions gave him a sense of direct connection to Berlin, as if those wires and valves were an umbilical cord linking him to the heart of the Nazi Reich. Each report carried details about RAF flight patterns, guard rotation schedules at sensitive installations, and information on civilian morale collected in pubs and public transport. Data that might individually seem insignificant, but together provided a detailed picture of Britain's vulnerabilities. Richter commented that he had never operated equipment so sophisticated, and Hoffman replied with pride that they represented the future of military espionage, agents of the 21st century operating in a war still bound to 19th century methods. The smooth texture of the controls beneath their fingers contrasted with the roughness of the paper where they wrote down codes, a constant reminder of the duality between high technology and traditional methods that defined their mission. Weeks passed in a seemingly successful sequence of intelligence gathering and regular transmissions, each day reinforcing their conviction that they had managed to establish themselves in London without arousing any suspicion from the British authorities. Hoffman developed a routine of visiting different pubs each night, always choosing establishments near military bases or government facilities where he could overhear casual conversations among employees who, after a few beers, became surprisingly indiscreet about matters that should have been classified as secret. The bitter taste of English beer, which he had initially found unpalatable, began to associate in his mind with small intelligence victories, each sip representing another valuable piece of information drawn from unwitting targets. Richter focused his attention on London's transport system, mapping with scientific precision the schedules and routes that would allow quick movement through the city in an emergency, knowledge. That could mean the difference between success and capture if anything went wrong. The constant roar of London traffic, mixed with the occasional rumble of planes overhead, created an urban soundtrack that gradually became familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Each transmission sent to Berlin was met with enthusiastic confirmations arriving through the same coded system. Messages that praised the quality of the information and encouraged expanding their intelligence operations. Hoffman felt a confidence bordering on euphoria growing inside him. They had achieved the impossible, establishing themselves in the heart of the British Empire as invisible ghosts, siphoning vital information without anyone even suspecting their existence. British arrogance, which the Abwehr training manuals had identified as the main weakness of the English national character, manifested itself exactly as predicted in every interaction they had with local authorities, government employees, or even ordinary citizens who seemed incapable of conceiving that enemy agents could operate freely on British soil. Hoffman watched with barely concealed amusement as policemen asked superficial questions during routine checks, satisfied with obvious answers and documents that, though forged with technical perfection, would never withstand a truly thorough investigation by competent professionals. Richter reported similar experiences in his contacts with railway station employees and minor government offices, people more concerned with quickly finishing their bureaucratic tasks than with actually verifying the authenticity of the information they received. The smell of carbon paper and stamp ink that permeated London's public offices became, in the minds of both agents, a symbol of the incompetent bureaucracy that facilitated their operations instead of hindering them. Each day that passed without incident reinforced the theory that the British had been completely blindsided by the sophistication of the German operation, unable to imagine that enemies could penetrate their defenses with such ease. The rough texture of English banknotes, which they handled daily in their fictitious commercial transactions, seemed to carry the fragility of an economic system soon to be exposed as vulnerable to the coordinated attacks of the Reich. Hoffman began to draft in his mind the final report he would send to Berlin, a document that would not only describe the mission's success but also recommend the immediate expansion of infiltration operations on British soil. The English live in a bubble of superiority that blinds them to obvious realities, Hoffman wrote in his personal diary. They cannot even imagine that their vaunted military intelligence could be surpassed by German methods. The interception happened on a damp December morning, when Bletchley Park's antennas picked up a signal that lasted exactly 47 seconds and completely changed the course of the silent war unfolding in the shadows of London. Margaret Thornfield adjusted her headphones with the care of someone who had learned to identify patterns in radio frequencies that escaped the notice of less experienced operators. Her fingers moved across the controls of the interception equipment with the delicacy of a pianist playing a particularly complex piece. The signal came through on the frequency normally used for merchant ship transmissions, but something in the cadence of dots and dashes struck her as different, a subtle irregularity that triggered instincts sharpened by months of non-stop work decoding enemy messages. Beside her, James Morrison meticulously recorded each intercepted fragment, filling out forms in the small, precise handwriting characteristic of the most dedicated members of the British intelligence service. The smell of cold coffee and carbon paper that permeated the interception room mingled with the penetrating scent of machine oil from the calculating machines, creating a dense atmosphere that seemed to concentrate all the tension of a war fought with numbers and frequencies instead of bullets and bombs. Margaret gave Morrison a silent gesture, indicating that there was something special about this transmission, something that warranted immediate attention from the senior cryptographers. Morrison nodded gravely and activated the recording system, preserving every second of that message he instinctively knew was important, even if he could not yet explain why. The rough texture of the paper on which he jotted down the codes contrasted with the smooth surface of the radio controls, a constant reminder of the duality between old methods and modern technology that defined the work at Bletchley Park. Professor Alan Whitmore received the transcript of the intercepted message 3 hours later, when the winter sun had already disappeared behind the heavy clouds that permanently covered the English sky at that time of year. His eyes quickly scanned the lines of code, immediately identifying patterns that revealed the use of a German encryption system not yet fully deciphered by Bletchley's mathematicians. The message contained references to wool merchants from Scotland in a frequency and context suggesting a code name for infiltrated agents, a discovery that made his pulse quicken with the excitement of someone who has just stumbled upon a crucial clue in a complex investigation. He immediately called his assistant, Patricia Goldstein, a young Cambridge mathematician whose ability to spot patterns in seemingly random sequences had proven invaluable in previous counter-espionage operations. Patricia studied the transcript with the intense concentration she brought to all cryptographic problems, her lips moving silently as she mentally tested different decoding possibilities. Whitmore's office smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, a comforting aroma that contrasted with the urgency of the situation unfolding before them. The walls, covered with blackboards scrawled with equations and diagrams, created an environment that seemed more suited to academic debates than to the life-or-death military operations they actually coordinated every day. Patricia murmured something about the grammatical structure of the message, noting that it contained a regional slang from northern Scotland rarely found in official German communications. Whitmore immediately recognized the importance of this observation. German-trained agents might be able to mimic British accents and mannerisms, but they would hardly know such specific dialect expressions. The ensuing investigation quietly mobilized some of Bletchley Park's best analysts, men and women who had devoted their careers to uncovering the Reich's most closely guarded secrets through methods combining mathematical genius with near-infinite patience. Morrison was assigned to coordinate a triangulation operation to determine the precise origin of the transmissions, a task that required installing monitoring equipment at strategic points around London without the German operators realizing they were being tracked. Margaret continued intercepting and recording all suspicious communications, gradually creating a detailed file that revealed not only the agent's location, but also their behavioral patterns, transmission schedules, and even individual quirks in the way they handled their radio equipment. The work was tedious and required absolute concentration during shifts that often stretched 12 to 15 hours. But each new fragment of information brought them closer to a complete understanding of the enemy operation. Patricia developed an analysis system capable of identifying specific keywords even when disguised by complex codes, a method that soon revealed the Germans were collecting information on RAF movements with surprising precision. The smell of chalk and eraser, dust rising from the constantly updated blackboards mingled with the strong aroma of tea consumed in industrial quantities. Fuel needed to maintain focus during extended sessions of intense intellectual work. Whitmore watched the progress of the investigation with growing satisfaction, realizing they had finally found a breach in the seemingly impenetrable armor of German espionage. The first major breakthrough came when Patricia succeeded in deciphering a specific reference to Russell Square, information that allowed MI5 agents to concentrate their investigation on a limited geographic area rather than scouring all of London in search of invisible spies. Morrison immediately coordinated a discreet surveillance operation in the area, positioning trained observers at strategic points from which they could monitor suspicious movements without alerting potential targets to their presence. The technique used was a refinement of methods developed over decades of counter-espionage operations, a system that allowed them to follow specific individuals through rotating teams of observers in such a way that continuous surveillance would never arouse suspicion. Margaret continued intercepting transmissions, now knowing exactly where to look and at what time signals were most likely to appear, a crucial advantage that turned a blind search into a directed operation with clear and measurable goals. Bletchley Park's equipment captured each transmission with crystal clarity, allowing detailed analysis not only of the message's content, but also of the technical characteristics revealing the type of equipment used by the Germans. Patricia identified patterns in the structure of the transmissions suggesting codes based on classical German literature, a discovery that opened new decoding possibilities by revealing the cultural foundation of the ciphers used. Whitmore realized they were dealing with high-level agents, people, trained by the Abwehr's best experts, and equipped with cutting-edge technology, a challenge that demanded the very best of Britain's counterintelligence resources. The texture of the sheets of paper on which they recorded their discoveries seemed rougher each day, as though the weight of the collected information could be physically felt through contact with documents holding secrets capable of altering the course of the war. The moment of truth came when Morrison was able to pinpoint precisely the Russell Square apartment from which the transmissions originated, a discovery immediately communicated to the upper echelons of MI5 through ultra-secret channels that ensured the information would not leak to other agencies or government departments. The decision not to immediately arrest the German agents was made after lengthy discussions among those in charge of the operation, who realized the unique opportunity to turn a defensive discovery into an offensive weapon against the Nazi espionage network itself. Whitmore proposed a bold plan. Instead of simply capturing the spies, they would use their knowledge of the operation to feed false information directly to Berlin, turning the German agents themselves into unwitting instruments of disinformation. Patricia was tasked with developing a system of fake messages convincing enough to deceive German analysts, but at the same time subtly incorrect, leading to strategic decisions that would harm the Nazi war effort. Margaret adjusted her equipment to monitor not only the infiltrated agents' transmissions, but also the responses arriving from Berlin, creating a complete picture of the information flow between London and the German High Command. The smell of fresh ink from the classified documents circulating among the various departments mingled with the persistent scent of tobacco that clung to the clothes of everyone at Bletchley Park, creating a dense atmosphere that seemed to carry the weight of secrets capable of determining the fate of entire nations. If we can make the Germans believe our lies as much as they believed in their own capabilities, Whitmore murmured, gazing at the maps of London spread across his desk, we will turn their greatest espionage operation into our greatest counterintelligence victory. The trap began to close on a cold January morning, when Hoffman first noticed that something had subtly changed in the behavior of the people around him, an almost imperceptible shift in how the staff at his morning cafe avoided direct eye contact, or how conversations cut off abruptly when he approached groups that had previously ignored him completely. The feeling was similar to what he had experienced during training in Brandenburg, when instructors simulated enemy surveillance scenarios, but now the threat seemed real and close enough to make his hands tremble slightly as he picked up his morning teacup. Richter reported similar experiences during his reconnaissance trips across different London neighborhoods, mentioning specifically an incident at an underground station where a middle-aged man began writing in a notebook right after watching him for several minutes with excessive attention. The familiar smell of coal and smoke that defined London mornings now seemed to carry a different quality, denser and more oppressive, as if the very atmosphere of the city were saturated with a tension they couldn't precisely define but felt growing with each passing day. Hoffman decided to alter his routine, choosing a different cafe for breakfast, a change he hoped would throw off any attempt at systematic surveillance. The rough texture of the morning paper beneath his fingers felt more pronounced, each page crackling with a sound that echoed menacingly in the tense silence that had settled between him and the outside world. Richter suggested they might be being excessively paranoid, but Hoffman knew that paranoia was often the difference between life and death in the world of international espionage. The nightly transmissions continued to be sent regularly, but now they carried an added weight of urgency, as if each message might be the last before something terrible happened. The first real confirmation that they were being watched came when Patricia Goldstein, working tirelessly in Bletchley Park's underground labs, managed to decipher a German message that made specific reference to increased security concerns among wool merchants, a phrase British cryptographers had already identified as a code name for the infiltrated agents in London. Morrison was now coordinating an even more sophisticated surveillance operation, using a network of observers rotating in 6-hour shifts to ensure continuous coverage without the same face appearing twice in the Germans' daily routine. Margaret was intercepting not only the spies' transmissions, but also the instructions arriving from Berlin, revealing growing anxiety within the Nazi high command about the security of the London operation. The German messages contained references to irregularities in local response patterns, suggesting that someone in Berlin was beginning to suspect the information coming from London wasn't entirely reliable. Whitmore realized they had reached the operation's critical moment. It was necessary to make a definitive decision about when to reveal to the Germans that their network had been discovered, and how to use that revelation to inflict maximum damage on the Nazi intelligence structure. The office where these discussions took place reeked of cold coffee and carbon paper, an aroma that had become associated in everyone's mind with decisions capable of altering the course of the World War. Patricia worked feverishly, decoding each new intercepted message, her eyes bloodshot with fatigue but her mind still functioning with the precision of a Swiss watch. The feel of the typewriter keys under her fingers had become as familiar as the touch of a musical instrument, each click representing another piece in the complex jigsaw puzzle finally beginning to reveal its full shape. Hoffman decided to accelerate the transmission schedule when he received a message from Berlin urgently, requesting information about British preparations for an offensive the German High Command believed was being planned for the spring of 1943. The request seemed routine, but something in the tone of the encrypted message unsettled him. An urgency absent from earlier communications that could indicate Berlin was beginning to question the effectiveness of the London operation. Richter set up the transmitter with the doubled care of someone who knows any operation could be the last, triple-checking every connection before starting the send sequence. The familiar hum of the radio as it warmed up sounded louder than usual, filling the silent apartment with a noise that, to the two tense Germans, felt like an alarm announcing imminent danger. The message they sent contained detailed information about supposed British troop movements that in reality had been carefully fabricated by Bletchley Park. Specialists, false but convincing, data intended to induce the German High Command to make strategic decisions detrimental to the Nazi war effort. Hoffman watched Richter work the controls and, for the first time in months, felt a stab of doubt about the invulnerability of their position on enemy soil. The hot metal smell from the radio's valves mixed with the scent of scorched paper from the electric heater, creating an olfactory combination he would forever associate with his last days of freedom in Britain. The rough texture of the paper where he wrote down transmission codes felt harsher beneath his sweaty fingers, as if the very material were reacting to the tension saturating the air of the small apartment. Richter remarked that Berlin's reply had arrived faster than usual, an observation that only heightened the anxiety they both tried to hide behind a facade of competent professionalism. The last transmission they sent to Berlin was intercepted simultaneously by 3 British monitoring stations, a triangulation that allowed them to determine with mathematical precision not only the agent's exact location, but also the power and technical characteristics of their equipment. Patricia decoded the message in real time, revealing that the Germans were requesting urgent instructions for a possible emergency evacuation, a clear sign they had finally realized their operation was compromised. Morrison received orders to intensify surveillance, positioning armed agents at every access point to the Russell Square apartment without yet proceeding with arrests, a strategy designed to ensure the spies couldn't escape when the final order to shut down the network was given. Margaret continued to intercept all communications, now aware that each transmission might reveal valuable information about other German agents operating in Britain or codes that would allow the decryption of messages related to future operations. Whitmore personally coordinated the operation's technical aspects, ensuring that when the time for arrests came, all necessary evidence would be properly documented and catalogued for use in subsequent interrogations. Bletchley Park now ran in emergency mode, every calculating machine operating at once to process the immense volume of information constantly flowing through the interception channels. The atmosphere in the underground corridors smelled of machine oil and warmed carbon paper, an industrial aroma that contrasted with the intellectual nature of the work taking place there 24 hours a day. Patricia felt her hands tremble slightly from exhaustion as she manipulated the decoding equipment, but her mind remained laser-focused, fully aware she was participating in a decisive moment in the history of intelligence warfare. The metallic feel of the controls beneath her fingers no longer felt foreign. It had become part of her own skin, a natural extension of a brain dedicated exclusively to uncovering the enemy's most closely guarded secrets. The final cordon took shape when MI5 agents discreetly occupied strategic positions around Russell Square, men trained in urban counter-espionage operations who knew exactly how to proceed to ensure none of the targets escaped once the arrest order was given. Hoffman woke on a gray February morning with the distinct sense that something had irreversibly changed during the night. A perception confirmed when he looked out the window and noticed less movement than usual in the square. As if the locals were instinctively avoiding the area, Richter prepared the transmitter for the last time. his hands shaking slightly as he connected the wires that had been their lifeline to the distant homeland through all those months of successful operations behind enemy lines. The message they intended to send was an urgent request for immediate evacuation instructions, a communication that would never reach its destination because, at the exact moment Richter keyed the transmitter, armed British agents burst into the apartment through both of the escape routes they had once deemed safe. The sound of heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs and the groan of forced hinges created a cacophony that instantly shattered the illusion of safety shielding them through months of clandestine work. Hoffman looked into Richter's eyes and saw reflected there the same bitter recognition that they had been outplayed by a superior, intelligence chess players who had discovered, too late, that their opponents knew every move they would make, before they themselves knew their next play. "German gentlemen," said a politely British voice behind them, "we believe you have a few explanations to offer about your Scottish wool trade." The interrogation began in a basement room at the War Office that smelled persistently of disinfectant and cold tobacco, an environment carefully designed to disorient prisoners through the complete absence of temporal or spatial references that might help them maintain any sense of control over their situation. Hoffman was separated from Richter immediately after the arrest, a standard tactic intended to prevent communication between accomplices and to create anxiety about the other's fate. A psychological technique that German interrogation manuals themselves recommended as highly effective against prisoners unprepared for prolonged resistance. The British officer who conducted the first session introduced himself simply as Major Thompson, a middle-aged man with a polished Oxford accent who displayed a surprisingly detailed knowledge of every aspect of the German operation, from the exact date of their landing on the English coast to the specific codes used in transmissions to Berlin. The wooden chair Hoffman was instructed to sit in had one leg slightly shorter than the others, an apparently accidental defect that in reality created constant physical discomfort meant to gradually undermine his ability to concentrate during long questioning sessions. Thompson smoked low-quality English cigarettes whose acrid smell filled the enclosed space, depriving the prisoner of the olfactory comfort of familiar aromas that might help him maintain an emotional connection to his memories of home. The electric light that illuminated the room came from a lamp, positioned to cast uncomfortable shadows on the face of whoever sat in the interrogation chair, a simple but effective technique to heighten the sensation of vulnerability and exposure. Hoffman tried to maintain the professional composure that had characterized his entire Abwehr career, but he sensed that something fundamental had changed in his situation. For the first time since the mission began, he was dealing with adversaries who seemed to know his methods better than he did. The rough texture of the paper on which Thompson wrote down his answers contrasted with the smooth surface of the metal table, a constant reminder that he now occupied the position of investigated object rather than investigating agent. The first major shock came when Thompson presented complete transcripts of conversations Hoffman had had with Richter in the Russell Square apartment, dialogues in German that had not only been intercepted but also translated with a precision, revealing intimate familiarity with military slang and Abwehr-specific technical expressions. The major calmly explained that microphones had been installed in the apartment 2 days after their arrival, an operation coordinated during one of Hoffman's morning absences when he left for his usual breakfast in Bloomsbury. Hoffman felt the world collapse around him as he realized that virtually from the first moment on British soil, his actions had been monitored, recorded, and analyzed by specialists who knew not only his immediate plans but also his deeper psychological motivations. Thompson lit another cigarette with deliberately slow gestures, allowing the information to be fully absorbed before revealing the next layer of the counter-espionage operation that had turned the German mission into a complete failure from its inception. The pages containing the transcripts were typed with the bureaucratic precision typical of the British civil service. Every word documented with an exact timestamp, evidence of the painstaking detail with which the entire operation had been catalogued. The smell of the carbon paper used for the copies mingled with the persistent disinfectant, creating an olfactory combination that Hoffman would forever associate with the humiliation of discovering he had been completely outmatched by adversaries he had considered intellectually inferior. Thompson mentioned casually that the recordings included not only operational conversations but also intimate moments when they discussed their families in Germany, personal information that could now be used against them in ways they preferred not to imagine. The revelation that his privacy had been so completely violated caused in Hoffman a wave of physical nausea that no resistance training had prepared him to face. The cold surface of the metal table beneath his sweaty hands seemed to draw the warmth from his body, leaving him with the sensation of being gradually drained, not only of information, but of his very humanity. Thompson went on to explain that the transmission equipment Richter had operated with such pride had been secretly modified during a search British agents conducted in the apartment while both Germans attended a social event at the Swedish consulate, an occasion they had considered perfect for forging contacts to legitimize their cover as international traitors. The modifications were too subtle to be detected by casual visual inspection, but they allowed every transmission to be simultaneously rebroadcast to British receivers, ensuring Bletchley Park had instant access not only to the content of the messages, but also to the replies arriving from Berlin. With growing horror, Hoffman realized that during all those months when he believed he was providing valuable intelligence to the German High Command, he had in fact been feeding Britain's counterintelligence system directly with information revealing not only his own plans but also the organizational structure and operational methods of the entire Nazi espionage network in Western Europe. Thompson showed him copies of the very messages he had sent to Berlin, documents that now revealed how every seemingly successful report had actually contributed to the systematic dismantling of German operations in Britain and in occupied territories. The sheets on which his decoded messages were printed had a slightly different texture from ordinary paper. A detail Thompson explained was due to the special process used to reproduce highly classified documents without compromising the security of the original interception methods. The Major lit another cigarette and watched with apparent satisfaction as the expression on Hoffman's face shifted gradually from professional defiance to horrified comprehension of the full extent of his manipulation. The room seemed to grow smaller with each revelation, the walls closing in as if the physical space itself conspired to amplify the sense of psychological claustrophobia inexorably mounting in the German prisoner's mind. The most devastating explanation came when Thompson revealed that the false information Britain had fed through the German espionage network had already resulted in disastrous strategic decisions by the Nazi High Command, including the redirection of military resources to defend non-existent targets and the cancellation of genuinely important operations based on completely fictitious reports of British military activity. Hoffman realized he had not only failed in his original mission but had actively helped weaken the German war effort in ways that would take months or years for Nazi strategists to fully grasp. Thompson presented detailed maps showing German troop movements directly influenced by false information transmitted through the network. Hoffman had believed he was operating with absolute success. The consequences of his unwitting manipulation extended far beyond his own capture, creating waves of disinformation that would continue to impact German military operations for the remainder of the war. The Major explained that other German agents operating in different parts of Europe had been identified and arrested using information obtained through interception of the London network's communications, revealing that the failure of Hoffman's mission had international ramifications he never could have imagined. The smell of fresh ink from the maps mixed with the persistent tobacco, creating a dense atmosphere that seemed to carry the weight of all the lives lost as a direct or indirect result of his operational incompetence. Thompson remarked that Berlin's strategists likely took weeks to realize they were receiving deliberately falsified information, weeks during which they continued to make decisions based on completely incorrect data provided inadvertently by the very espionage system they considered most reliable. The rough texture of the military maps beneath Hoffman's fingers seemed to carry the physical weight of all the German defeats his naivete had helped cause. The realization that he had become an active instrument of sabotage against his own nation produced a vertigo no military training had prepared him to face. Thompson concluded the session by revealing that Richter had fully cooperated with British interrogators after learning the extent of the manipulation both men had suffered, providing detailed information on Abwehr training methods, locations of secret bases, and identities of other German agents operating in neutral territory. The news that his partner had broken under pressure was less shocking than the subsequent revelation that Richter's cooperation was actually unnecessary. The British already possessed all the information he could provide, through interceptions and decryptions, conducted during months of supervised operation. Hoffman understood that his arrest did not mark the end of a successful espionage operation, but rather the natural conclusion of a counterintelligence experiment that had used his own professional competence against him, systematically and relentlessly. Thompson crushed his cigarette in an ashtray already overflowing with butts and explained that Hoffman now had a simple choice: cooperate fully by providing information on aspects of the German organization that remained unclear, or face trial for espionage with evidence so overwhelming that the verdict would inevitably be the death penalty. The silent room echoed only with the sound of the two men's heavy breathing, one representing the triumph of British intelligence, the other confronting the reality that he had been turned into an involuntary pawn in a chess game whose rules he had never fully understood. The smell of disinfectant seemed stronger now, as if the very atmosphere were being sterilized to remove any trace of the professional dignity Hoffman had carried with him since the mission began. Thompson noted that the Abwehr had probably already reached its own conclusions about the failure of the London operation, suggesting that even if Hoffman managed to escape and return to Germany, he would face even harsher interrogations by his own superiors, eager to understand how supposedly elite agents had been so thoroughly deceived by adversaries they had considered amateurs. The cold texture of the metal table beneath his hands seemed to drain not only his body heat but any vestige of hope that he might still find some form of professional or personal salvation from the complete catastrophe his career had become. "Arrogance, Mr. Hoffman," Thompson said, carefully filing the documents into a classified folder, "proved a far more fatal vulnerability than any technical flaw in your methods. You never imagined we might be smarter. The cell where Hoffman was kept over the following weeks was too small to allow proper exercise, but large enough to amplify every outside sound until it became a constant psychological torture. From the steady drip of a leaking pipe to the distant footsteps of guards walking down corridors he would never see. The bare brick walls exuded a perpetual damp that created dark stains in the corners, irregular patterns his unsettled mind began interpreting as maps of lost territories or the faces of comrades killed in earlier operations. Hallucinations born of the combination of sensory isolation and mounting guilt. The only furniture consisted of a narrow bed with a thin mattress that smelled of cheap disinfectant and the sweat of previous occupants, a constant reminder that the space had housed other prisoners who had likely faced fates he preferred not to imagine in detail. Thompson visited irregularly, sometimes going days without appearing and other times returning 2 or 3 times within the same 24-hour period, a strategy designed to prevent Hoffman from developing any mental routine that might help him maintain psychological stability during prolonged captivity. Meals arrived at variable times, often cold and always tasting of wet paper, suggesting hurried preparation by staff who cared nothing for nutritional quality or palatability, only for the minimal maintenance of physical health necessary to continue interrogations. During the long hours of silence, Hoffman mentally replayed every decision made since landing on the English coast, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when everything had begun to go wrong. An exercise that invariably led him to the disturbing conclusion that perhaps they had never had a real chance of success. The rough texture of the prison uniform against his skin had become uncomfortably familiar, a constant reminder of how he had fallen from elite agent to common criminal in the hands of adversaries he had completely underestimated. Nights were worse than days, because in complete darkness his imagination created ever more elaborate scenarios about what might be happening to Richter, fantasies that ranged from irrational hopes of escape to detailed visions of summary execution. Thompson returned on a gray morning carrying a thick folder containing what he described as a complete analysis of the German operation, from its early planning stages in Berlin to the final capture in London, a document that revealed the staggering level of infiltration the British had achieved within Abwehr's very organizational structure. The photographs inside showed Hoffman and Richter at various moments of the mission, buying supplies, walking London streets, even relaxing in the Russell Square apartment, images captured without their ever noticing the presence of professional photographers working at considerable distances with specialized equipment. Thompson explained that surveillance had begun even before their arrival on British soil, revealing that double agents infiltrated within Abwehr had provided detailed information on every aspect of the mission, including the participants' identities, planned infiltration methods, and specific objectives to be achieved. Hoffman studied the photographs with growing horror, recognizing on his own face an expression of arrogant confidence that now seemed grotesquely out of place given how completely he had been deceived at every moment of the operation. The smell of photographic paper mingled with the cell's persistent disinfectant, creating an olfactory combination that would forever be linked in his memory to the humiliation of discovering his professional competence had been illusory. Thompson remarked that the photographs would eventually be used in training materials for future British agents, serving as an example of how seemingly successful infiltration operations might in reality be entirely controlled by competent counterintelligence. The folder also contained transcripts of meetings held in Berlin where Abwehr superiors discussed the progress of the London mission based on reports Hoffman had sent, documents revealing how his involuntary lies had influenced strategic decisions much higher up the German military hierarchy. The smooth texture of the photographs contrasted with the roughness of the transcript's paper, a tactile difference symbolizing the duality between incontestable visual evidence and bureaucratic documentation of the political consequences of his failure. The most devastating revelation came when Thompson showed him intercepted correspondence between senior Abwehr officers discussing the possible contamination of the London network weeks before his arrest, suggesting that some people in Berlin already suspected the operation had been compromised but had decided to continue it for reasons he could not fully understand. The letters revealed internal debates about whether to order an immediate evacuation or keep the agents in place to see if they could determine exactly how the British had discovered their presence. Discussion indicating that he and Richter had been consciously sacrificed by superiors who considered them expendable resources in a broader investigation. Thompson explained that the German decision not to evacuate the compromised network had given the British additional weeks to extract valuable information about Abwehr's organizational structures and operational methods, weeks during which each extra day of freedom had produced increasing damage to German espionage capability in Western Europe. Hoffman understood that he had not only failed in his specific mission, but had been abandoned by his own superiors, who knew or suspected his precarious situation, yet chose to use his inevitable capture as an opportunity to gather intelligence about British counter-espionage capabilities. The correspondence also revealed that other German agents operating in neutral territory had been ordered to keep their distance from any operation related to the London network, suggesting that Berlin was prepared to cut all ties with him and Richter if they were captured. The smell of old ink from the intercepted documents mixed with the aroma of carbon paper, creating a dense atmosphere that seemed to bear the weight of all the bureaucratic betrayals that had helped turn his mission into a complete catastrophe. Thompson noted that the coldness with which the German superiors discussed their own agent's fate had impressed even veterans of the British intelligence service, who were used to dealing with the darker aspects of international espionage. The texture of the intercepted letters was slightly different from ordinary paper, a detail Thompson explained as the result of chemical processes used to reveal invisible inks that some messages contained as an extra security layer. Thompson then revealed that Richter had attempted suicide in his cell 3 days after learning they had been abandoned by their superiors, an attempt thwarted only by the quick intervention of guards who had kept him under constant watch since the beginning of captivity. The news filled Hoffman with a mixture of horror and understanding. He himself had considered similar options during the longest nights when the reality of his situation became unbearable to contemplate. Thompson explained that Richter had regained enough mental stability to cooperate fully with interrogators, providing not only technical information about equipment and codes, but also detailed psychological analyses of the training methods Abwehr used to prepare agents for infiltration behind enemy lines. The information Richter provided had allowed the British to identify other German operations in development, resulting in the preemptive capture of at least 6 additional agents before they could establish operational positions in Britain or neutral territory. Thompson showed photographs of some of those agents, men Hoffman recognized from the training grounds in Brandenburg, comrades now facing the same fate of capture and interrogation he was experiencing. The scent of the freshly developed photographs mixed with the cell's persistent disinfectant, creating an olfactory combination that amplified the nausea accompanying each new revelation about the extent of the disaster his incompetence had caused. The realization that his failure had led to the capture of innocent colleagues added a layer of guilt No military training had prepared him to process properly. Thompson observed that Richter's cooperation had been motivated not only by coercion but also by genuine horror upon learning how thoroughly they had been manipulated, suggesting that some German agents were capable of recognizing intellectual superiority when confronted with incontrovertible evidence. The final interrogation session took place in a different room, larger and better lit, a change Thompson explained as a courtesy to facilitate the signing of documents that would formalize Hoffman's full cooperation with British authorities in exchange for treatment as a prisoner of war rather than a spy condemned to death. The walls of this new room were covered with detailed maps showing German military operations across Europe, many of which had been influenced directly or indirectly by false information transmitted through the network he had so confidently operated. Hoffman studied the maps with growing understanding of the magnitude of the damage his naivete had inflicted on the German war effort, realizing that battles had been lost and soldiers killed as a direct result of strategic decisions based on his reports, which had been involuntarily fabricated by the British. Thompson explained that his cooperation would be used primarily to verify information already obtained from other sources, ensuring the British possessed a complete and accurate picture of the capabilities and limitations of German espionage in Western Europe. The pen offered for his signature had an unusual weight. A detail Thompson remarked was due to the special material used in instruments intended for particularly important or sensitive agreements. The smell of fresh ink from the documents mingled with the leather aroma of the folders in which they would be filed, creating a solemn atmosphere that contrasted with the humiliating nature of what was being formalized by his signature. Thompson commented that few German agents had shown the capacity to fully recognize the extent of their manipulation, suggesting that Hoffman possessed enough intelligence to grasp realities other prisoners preferred to deny, even when confronted with incontrovertible evidence. The texture of the official paper beneath his fingers seemed to carry the weight of all the lives lost as a result of his incompetence, turning the simple act of signing into a ceremony of accepting responsibility for consequences that would extend far beyond his own capture and punishment. "The war will continue for years, Mr. Hoffman," Thompson said, watching him sign the final document. "But your involuntary contribution to the British victory is already complete. You've taught us more about German espionage than we could have discovered through a decade of conventional investigation." The months that followed the formalization of his cooperation brought a peculiar routine that mixed elements of house arrest with involuntary consulting work, a situation Thompson described as supervised technical collaboration, designed to extract specialized knowledge without creating dangerous precedents for the treatment of future prisoners of war. Hoffman was transferred to a rural facility on the outskirts of London, a government-requisitioned country house discreetly converted into a long-term interrogation center where captured agents could be kept in relatively comfortable conditions while providing detailed information on the technical aspects of their original organizations. The room assigned to him had real windows that let in natural light, a luxury he had forgotten during months of captivity in underground cells, but the discreetly installed bars reminded him constantly that he remained a prisoner despite the improved treatment. Thompson visited regularly, sometimes accompanied by specialists in different facets of German espionage who asked specific questions about equipment, codes, recruitment methods, and organizational structures, questions Hoffman answered with growing resignation. The food was substantially better than in the military cells, prepared by civilian staff who seemed to understand that well-fed prisoners were more cooperative during prolonged sessions of technical questioning. The smell of freshly cut grass drifting through the open windows contrasted sharply with the disinfectant aroma that had dominated his senses for months, an olfactory change that gradually helped restore some of the mental stability necessary to process the full magnitude of his situation. Thompson explained that other German agents captured in similar operations had been housed at the same facility, suggesting there was a well-developed system for extracting expert knowledge from high-value prisoners without resorting to methods that might compromise the quality of the information obtained. The texture of the cotton sheets on the bed was familiar in a way that bordered on comforting, reminding him of domestic details from a former life that seemed to have existed decades earlier rather than months. Richter was brought to the same facility a few weeks later, apparently recovered from the mental collapse he had suffered during the initial interrogations, but visibly transformed by the experience of discovering how completely they had been manipulated by adversaries they had considered intellectually inferior. The reunion between the former partners was carefully supervised by Thompson, who seemed interested in observing how they would react upon seeing each other again. After months of separate captivity and individual interrogations that had revealed different facets of the same disastrous operation, Richter had lost considerable weight and developed a nervous tremor in his hands, which surfaced whenever he discussed technical aspects of the transmitter equipment he had once operated with such professional pride during the active phase of the mission. Their conversation was initially hesitant, heavy with mutual guilt and self-recrimination for mistakes that now seemed obvious in retrospect, but had been completely imperceptible at the time, even to agents trained by Abwehr's best experts. Thompson allowed them to spend some time alone, later, explaining the strategy as a way to let them process the reality of their situation emotionally, without the added pressure of constant observation by representatives of the authority that had captured them. The garden where they were permitted to walk during supervised periods smelled of spring flowers, an aroma that contrasted bitterly with memories of the London winter, when they still believed their mission was succeeding. Richter commented that he had spent weeks trying to identify the exact moment when everything had gone wrong, an exercise that invariably led him to the disturbing conclusion that perhaps they had never had any real control over any aspect of their operation. The feel of the grass beneath their feet during the supervised walks offered a tactile connection to the natural world long denied during months of confinement in artificial environments, a small pleasure that gradually helped restore some of the psychological stability needed to contemplate an uncertain future. Thompson revealed during one of his regular visits that information obtained through their interrogations had been used to dismantle Abwehr's structure in Western Europe completely, an operation that resulted in the identification and capture of more than 40 German agents operating in Britain, neutral countries, and even in some areas of occupied France. The news that his cooperation had contributed to the capture of so many colleagues filled Hoffman with a complex mix of horror and relief. Horror at the involuntary betrayal of innocent comrades, but relief at the understanding that at least his cooperation was serving to shorten a war that increasingly seemed lost for Germany. Thompson showed him photographs of some of the captured agents, men Hoffman recognized from the training grounds and who now faced interrogations similar to those he himself had endured during the first months of captivity. The photographs revealed that many had been captured under circumstances similar to his own, suggesting that Abwehr's infiltration methods had become entirely predictable to British counterintelligence, which had learned to anticipate and neutralize German operations before they could be properly established. Thompson explained that the espionage war had turned into a complete Allied victory, largely because German agents continued operating with methods the British had learned to detect and manipulate with growing ease. The smell of Thompson's pipe tobacco mingled with the scent of photographic paper, an olfactory combination Hoffman would forever associate with sessions in which he discovered new dimensions of the catastrophe his incompetence had helped create. Richter studied the photographs in silence, his tremor intensifying visibly when he recognized familiar faces among the prisoners captured using information they themselves had involuntarily provided. News of Hitler's suicide arrived via BBC radio broadcasts that Thompson allowed them to listen to on a gray April afternoon, a moment that officially ended any hope that they might eventually return to Germany as redeemed heroes, rather than involuntary traitors who had contributed to the Reich's defeat. Hoffman listened to the announcement with mixed feelings, relief at the end of a war that had clearly become hopeless, but also terror at what might happen to German prisoners once there was no longer any possibility of exchange or negotiation with a government that had ceased to exist. Thompson explained that cooperative prisoners would likely eventually be relocated to other countries where they could rebuild their lives under new identities, an outlook that offered some hope for a future, even if one completely disconnected from anything they had previously known. Richter asked about the possibility of returning to Germany after hostilities ended. "Weinbuch?" question Thompson answered with a careful explanation that agents who had cooperated with British intelligence would likely be considered traitors by any future German government, regardless of its political orientation. The realization that he had lost not only the war, but also any possibility of returning home, caused in Hoffman an existential vertigo no military training had prepared him to face. The sound of the radio broadcast echoed through the quiet room, English words, announcing events that fundamentally altered the context of everything they had experienced during years of war and months of captivity. Thompson remarked that many German prisoners faced similar dilemmas, forced to choose between loyalty to a regime that had vanished and pragmatic adaptation to completely transformed political realities. The bakelite radio's surface under Hoffman's fingers felt as though it carried the weight of all the historical changes being announced through invisible waves crossing oceans and continents. Richter murmured that perhaps it was better this way, suggesting that at least they would not have to face German courts investigating how two supposedly elite agents had been so thoroughly deceived by adversaries they had considered amateurs. The decision about their final fate was communicated on a sunny May morning, when Thompson arrived accompanied by officials from different government departments who explained in detail the options available to German prisoners who had substantially cooperated with British authorities during prolonged interrogations. The first possibility involved relocation to Canada or Australia under completely new identities, a process that would require abandoning any connection with their previous lives but offered a real opportunity to start over in an environment where no one would know their history as captured Nazi agents. Thompson explained that several former prisoners had chosen this option and were apparently adapting well to civilian life in rural communities where technical skills were valued regardless of national origin or previous political affiliation. The second option consisted of remaining in the United Kingdom to work as technical consultants for government agencies that needed German expertise to fully understand equipment and methods captured during the war, an arrangement that would allow them to maintain some degree of professional activity related to their previous experience. Hoffman studied the documents describing both alternatives carefully, realizing that any choice would represent the symbolic death of the person he had been throughout his adult life devoted to German military service. The smell of fresh ink from the official forms mingled with the scent of spring, flowers drifting through the open windows, a combination symbolizing the duality between administrative bureaucracy and natural renewal that characterized that moment of transition. Richter remarked that he preferred the idea of starting over completely rather than continuing to work in a field that would constantly remind him of past failures, an observation Thompson noted carefully as part of the process of determining individual destinies. The texture of the official documents beneath their fingers felt heavier than ordinary paper, as if the very material were infused with the importance of the decisions they were being asked to make. The last meeting with Thompson took place on a June afternoon, after they had already signed all the papers necessary to establish new identities and arrange passage to countries where they could try to rebuild lives completely disconnected from anything related to war or espionage. Thompson appeared carrying a bottle of scotch, whiskey in 3 glasses, a gesture he explained as a personal tradition to mark the successful conclusion of counterintelligence operations that were particularly complex or satisfying. The whiskey's smooth taste contrasted with memories of German spirits they had consumed during training in Brandenburg, a difference that symbolized all the cultural transformations they would have to absorb to survive in countries where Germans were still viewed with suspicion and hostility. Thompson toasted Riley to the most successful self-sabotage operation in the history of modern espionage, a remark that provoked bitter but genuine laughter, the first expression of humor any of them had experienced since the capture months earlier. The conversation that followed was surprisingly cordial, with Thompson answering questions about technical aspects of the operation that had remained obscure during formal interrogations, explanations that helped Hoffman and Richter fully understand how they had been manipulated from the very first moment on British soil. Thompson revealed that some aspects of the British counter-operation had been improvised in response to opportunities created by the German agents' own technical competence, suggesting that, ironically, their professional skill had contributed to the effectiveness of the manipulation they had suffered. The smell of whiskey mingled with the leather aroma of the chairs they sat in, creating an almost civilized atmosphere that contrasted dramatically with the hostility that had characterized their first encounters months earlier. Richter asked whether Thompson felt any personal satisfaction at having completely deceived two agents specifically, trained to detect and avoid such manipulation, a question the Major answered with surprising honesty about the intellectual pleasure derived from well-executed operations, regardless of broader moral implications. Thompson concluded the meeting by presenting them with copies of the final reports to be sent to the historical archives of the British Intelligence Service, documents that described the entire operation, from the initial interception of the transmissions to the final decision regarding the fate of cooperative prisoners. The reports were written in a technical, dispassionate language that turned months of terror, humiliation, and the gradual discovery of truth into a sequence of bureaucratic procedures executed with the administrative efficiency characteristic of the British civil service. Hoffman read his own description as technically competent agent, but psychologically vulnerable to manipulation due to overconfidence in German methods, an analysis that acknowledged his professional skills while precisely identifying the psychological weakness that had made his complete manipulation possible. Thompson explained that the reports would serve as study material for future generations of intelligence officers, ensuring that the methods developed during the operation would be preserved and refined for use against future adversaries attempting similar infiltration. The understanding that his humiliation would be studied and analyzed for decades as an example of how enemy agents can be involuntarily turned into instruments of self-sabotage added an additional dimension of lasting embarrassment that would accompany any attempt at psychological reconstruction. Richter commented that at least their mistakes would contribute to the education of future professionals, an observation Thompson praised as a rare display of maturity among prisoners who generally preferred to deny the reality of their circumstances. The smell of carbon paper from the reports mingled with the residual aroma of whiskey, a combination that would forever be associated in Hoffman's memory with the final acceptance that he had been completely outmatched by adversaries whose competence he had fatally underestimated. The smooth texture of the typed pages contrasted with the roughness of his skin, dried out by months of stress and confinement, a tactile difference symbolizing the distance between officially documented reality and the lived experience during the transformation from confident agent to cooperative prisoner. "You taught us," Thompson said, carefully filing the reports into a leather folder, "that even the best agents can be defeated not by technical flaws, but by the inability to imagine that others might be smarter. That will be the most valuable lesson you leave to the history of modern espionage." Wilhelm Hoffman and Klaus Richter vanished from the official record in July 1945, boarding different ships bound for Canada under names never revealed in the declassified files decades later. Their true fates remain unknown, but the counterintelligence methods developed during their capture and interrogation became foundational to British national security operations throughout the Cold War. The operation was later classified as one of the most successful manipulations of enemy agents in modern history, demonstrating that intellectual arrogance can be a more fatal vulnerability than any technical defect in equipment or training. The operation's full archives remained sealed for 50 years, only partially released in 1995, with extensive redactions that protect identities and methods still considered sensitive by contemporary intelligence services.